God, I know this might be a weird way to start out a prayer, but I pray that you will give us heavy hearts as we go into this passage today. I know that typically we pray that you will relieve our heavy hearts, but I think that it's best for us going into this particular passage that we read it with a certain air of solemnness and that we recognize the weight of the passage we're about to go through, and that you will actually allow our hearts to break as we see the depths of sin into which even men after your own heart can fall. And that it will be a warning lesson for us, God, so that we won't just simply understand the story, but that we'll understand the implications of it in our own lives, and that we'll learn to succeed where David failed. I pray that your Spirit will give us understanding as we go into your word, and that we won't take this time for granted, but we'll set aside any distractions that would keep us from focusing on you, and that we'll genuinely just draw near to you, God. And that as we read the story of David, maybe we'll see a little bit of ourselves in him. And we'll recognize that we, like him, are in desperate need of your grace. And we, like him, are capable of far worse things than we could have ever imagined. We love you, God. We praise you for being the righteous seed of David who came to deliver us from our sins. Let us never approach your word with that truth far from our mind. It's in your name we pray. Amen. All right. So before we hop into the scripture, real quick, I do have a quick request. And this request comes not just directly from me, but actually the people in our YouTube comments and also people who have emailed me. They want to know if y'all could possibly speak a little louder whenever y'all share stuff. Because they say that they can hear me, but there's sometimes when y'all say stuff that they can't quite hear. And they say that as much as they love hearing my stuff, they would love to hear y'all's contributions as well. Which I agree. And the things y'all say are also very helpful for the discussion. And I have received some comments and emails. So people actually are hungry to hear what you have to say. And so if you say anything, just speak up a little bit more.
Yell it out.
Yeah, what's that?
Yell it out.
Yell it out. So you shouldn't have to yell it, but the microphone should be able to pick it up as long as you're kind of speaking at a somewhat loudish voice. Okay, we are in 2 Samuel chapter 11, and I am going to give us the briefest context possible just so that we can hop into the story. There's this guy named David, and he is the second king of Israel. The first king of Israel, not a great guy. He is very much a product of his time, because prior to that, Israel was not in a very good place, were they? You had the period of the Judges, where they had just arrived in the land after the Exodus, and they were not obeying the law that God had given them. They were not pursuing God. They were doing what was right in their own eyes. And then there was a short time period where this guy named Samuel led them as their judge, the final judge. Things went well, but then King Saul, not great. He started out all right, but then very quickly spiraled downwards. And for the last few months, we have been tracking the life of David, right? He started off as a just simple shepherd boy, but eventually rose through the ranks of Saul's army, and now Saul is out of the way, and David is king. And really, for the first 10 chapters of 2 Samuel, we have seen David doing amazing things, right? And just one chapter after the next, we have seen how God has provided for David and how God has just pushed David further and further into the limelight, which is stuff that we've been waiting for in 1 Samuel, right? In 1 Samuel, we had kind of this long, extended period. Really, the back half of 1 Samuel is us just waiting and wondering, when will David be on the throne, right? He's anointed as a teenager, but he's not, he's 30 by the time he actually sits on a throne, and he's 37 before he actually is the king of everything God promised him, right? And so a lot of David's story was waiting for him to be king. And finally, you get to 2 Samuel chapter 2, and he is made king. And chapter after chapter, we have just seen amazing things from David, right? He conquers Jerusalem. He makes it his capital. He brings the Ark of the Covenant there so that it's his political and religious capital. He is now living next door to God. God makes a covenant to David and promises him an eternal dynasty. The Messiah will come through David. And in that promise, God declares that David is basically the central focal point of God's plan in the universe, right? You have to realize how big a deal chapter 7 is. God made a promise back in Genesis that he was going to fix all the problems that man had brought into the world through sin. And he basically tells David, I'm going to do it through you. So David becomes, at this point in history, the single most important human being alive. Because salvation dwells in his loins. Right? It's going to come through him. And we've been tracking his success in chapters 8, 9, and 10. We have seen where he had all these victories in battle in chapter 8. In chapter 9, he showed kindness to Saul's family, right, through Mephibosheth. And in chapter 10, he tried to show kindness to a foreign guy, but that guy actually rejected it. And even though the guy rejected David's kindness, David ended up stumbling into even more power. And so where we leave David off with in chapter 10 is David at the highest point in his entire kingship. But unfortunately, if you've been reading scripture enough, you know what's coming next. Because what typically happens whenever people get to the pinnacle point in life?
They fall.
Yeah. And we've seen this especially being true with the people of God. I know that a lot of the times we pray for an easy life, but typically the people of God don't do well when they have an easy life. We actually thrive whenever we are being persecuted and whenever we're going through a lot of stuff. Because those are the things that force us onto our knees, onto our faces, crying out to God. Whenever things are going well, we typically get lazy, we get distracted, we get idle, and we start focusing on all the things that could tempt us. And that was true, that's been true everywhere so far, right? Adam and Eve, Garden of Eden, things are going well, they choose to eat the fruit, right? You see Abraham, he goes to the land God promised, and then he goes down to Egypt, right? It's again and again and again and again. The people of Israel, they're freed from captivity, and they start grumbling against God, right? They arrive at the mountain of God where God is giving them the law that he has promised, and they turn and worship a golden calf. They finally arrive in the promised land, the land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and it's now theirs. And they start doing what's right in their own eyes. Right? This is the story of God's people. Success usually does not end well. And it takes, we have more examples of people going through some really hard stuff and being faithful to God than we do of people having a really good life and being faithful to God. Because typically, it's just harder. And so I know that in our heads, in our hearts, we kind of idealize, I just want this life for myself, but it doesn't typically go well. And you have to be a super strong and focused individual to actually endure prosperity and not fall away from God. David is a man after God's own heart, and he's not going to handle prosperity well. Solomon will be the wisest man in the world, and he will not handle prosperity well. Right? The only person who can actually handle that stuff is Jesus. Right? And that's why we have to rely on him. So even before we enter into the story, we can already see where this is going, because we have seen David on this upward trajectory, but we've also seen enough things throughout the story to know that David is not perfect. And so we know that he can't just keep going up, because there's got to be something that's the only person who can continually receive more and more praise and not eventually fall down is God. Right? And so we've seen enough chinks in David's armor to realize that something big is going to have to happen. Chapter 11 is the big thing. And so unfortunately, last week's chapter was the last week that we're actually going to see David having a content life. Right? The last two chapters, in many ways, it's kind of heartbreaking. Because you have this guy who life is just going so well that he just wants to give to others. And then in this one chapter, he's going to decide to take something for himself. And he's going to feel the consequences of that the rest of his life. In chapter 12, he's going to repent, and things are going to be better spiritually, but physically his life is going to be in shambles from this point forward. And so this chapter really just shakes things up. That's the context, and it's a very, very sad story. And we're going to walk our way slowly through it. Hopefully we make it through the full chapter. If not, I have no problem pushing this off, because when it comes to application, I think that this chapter is just full of it. Sometimes it's hard to apply things whenever you see somebody being so awesome, because you're like, that's just not me. This, every single verse, you're like, oh, yep, I've done that. Yep, I've done that. And so, y'all ready to go into it?
Let's do it.
I'm not sure if I'm ready, but we'll go for it anyways. Sean, take it away.
All right. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him, and all Israel. And they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon, when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Uriah, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, "I am pregnant."
All right. 5 verses in, and this is horrible. This is just this chapter, David's just not looking good, and it's just gonna get worse, right? I mean, this is one of those things where we've been tracking with David every single chapter, week by week by week, and there's been a few things where David is like messed up, and you're like, okay, but honestly, when you get to this chapter, David just seems like a totally different person, right? This does not sound like the David that we have known. What are some things that stick out to y'all before we actually start walking through it? Yeah.
It says in verse 1, when kings go out to battle, or in the spring, the time when kings go out to battle, David's the king. He didn't go out to battle like he's supposed to be.
Yeah.
When you think of that, you also think about Saul. He did the same thing.
Yep.
He didn't go out to battle. People under him go.
Well, that's the scary thing. I've actually been reading this commentary where this guy talks about, like he's actually walking through 1st and 2nd Samuel, and I like how he's really exploring the things by just like the themes, right? And he traces just some of the parallels between like character arcs throughout the stories, and he points out that in this chapter, like you could basically take David's name and replace it with Saul, and it would seem consistent. Right? Because David is acting exactly like Saul in this chapter. Because there was that story, right? Remember whenever Saul sent all these other guys out, and it talks about like the people like laying siege, and like Saul's just like chilling under a tree? Right? This is not good. And that's the thing. Even before you get to verse 2, right? Verse 2 is where we start meeting Bathsheba and see all this stuff. Verse 1 by itself tells us enough to realize something is wrong.
Verse 1's a red flag.
Yeah, like verse 1 you're like, oh no. It's like, that's not good. Interestingly, whenever you get to the book of Chronicles, right? So whenever you look at 1st and 2nd Chronicles, it actually also retells the story of David, but just from a different perspective. And it doesn't tell the David and Bathsheba story, because it's less focused on David's failures, and it's more focused on his successes. And the only thing it tells you about this entire story in chapters 11 and 12 is just verse 1. Right? It says, oh yeah, and then David stayed home, and then it just moves on. And it's so interesting, like where you could just say that and then move on, and you would never know the rest of this happened. But that verse by itself lets you know that something is not going on here. Like, something is not right here. Anything else to stick out to y'all before we break it down more?
I think Rocky hit the nail on the head, because I was going to say that he stayed back in Jerusalem when he should have been out at battle.
Yeah. All right, let's walk through it. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. Okay, let's talk about that. What does it mean when the time when kings go out to battle?
Good question.
I'm going to take a shot in the dark and say in the spring of the year is just better fighting conditions.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. It seems kind of weird to us that people would be like, all right, and fighting season has started. It sounds kind of like sports, right? It's like, oh, it's football season. But that is kind of how they treated it back then. And you have to realize, like, they were a lot more like, they had to deal with just the weather conditions, and especially in like the Middle East area, you would have winter rains, right? And then you would have rains in the late spring. And if you're like mainly fighting on like chariots and stuff, that's just not useful, right? Because this is going to be muddy and it's not going to be helpful. So it was advantageous to do it during the dry season. During the spring, it's right in between the two rainy seasons. That was the time where, it wasn't too hot, and it was the perfect time where kings were like, okay, we're going to meet up, we're going to see whose armies are better, and we're going to conquer some land, right? It seems kind of weird to us, but that's just how they did it, right? So there was this kind of set time whenever kings would go out to battle, and that time had arrived, but David doesn't go. David sends Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. Okay, well, we've seen stuff like this before, right? I mean, what's up?
He sent Joab, was it in chapter, or in the, in like chapter 2 with Abner?
Yeah. Yeah, he sent Joab there, and even in chapter 10, the one y'all led last week.
Oh, yeah.
Remember, Joab was there for one fight, and then David showed up for the later one, right? Yeah. And so, this isn't necessarily out of character for David, and you have to realize that it isn't inherently bad for him to stay home, if he's got a reason for it, right? I mean, but the thing is, that's not why he's doing it, right? Like, it's not like he has a reason for staying home. It's not like he's just like, oh, I'm just too old. No. Like, we're going to see that in the story that follows, it was simply him just, like, you can almost read into it why he stayed home, right? You can read into it a form of, like, laziness or entitlement, where he's like, I fought my share of battles. I've earned some rest, right? And we'll talk about that in a second. But he sends Joab out and his servants with him and all Israel, right? So the implications, obviously it wasn't literally every single person in Israel going out, but the language is to emphasize the fact that David should be there, right? He sent Joab, his commander, and all Joab's servants, and all Israel. So even though there are other people still home, obviously, the idea, the picture that the narrator is trying to put in your mind is that everybody's at war except for David, which is weird because the king should be leading the people into battle, right? It's different than like our current societies, right? We would never expect the president to go into battle just because that would be very weird to us. But in those cultures, that's what you did. You led by example, and if you were the king, you needed to be out in battle unless you had a darn good reason to not be out there, right? He sends Joab and his servants and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. This is actually what we saw back in chapter 10. We don't know whether or not it's the same exact battle, but I kind of hope it wasn't, just because chapter 10 was actually a good point. Chapter 10 was actually a kind of good moment for David. I would hate to think that all this stuff is going on at the same time, but it's possible. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, and then this is where you get that fatal phrase, but David remained at Jerusalem. Let's just talk about that for a second. Step into David's head. Why do you think he might want to stay home?
He doesn't feel like going to war. He doesn't feel like fighting because, like you said, he's had his share of battles. And he's like, it's time for me to rest and just take it easy.
Mm-hmm. Rocky?
Yeah, something good waiting for him at home.
yeah, he might have something else on his mind. Yeah, we don't fully know what made David stay home. For all we know, it wasn't even his suggestion. You know what? Maybe Joab was like, you know what, King? I think you deserved your rest. Whatever it was, David stayed home, and I feel like you could step in his mind and kind of put some ideas there, just because we know the human heart, right? And we have seen David have one success after another, after another, after another, and typically he's very good at giving the credit to God and saying, thanks be to God, but even the people who are best at doing that, they mess up. And my own speculations, once again, I can't say this for sure, my own speculations is that at some point, David stopped giving the credit to God and started thinking, look at all I've accomplished, right? Look at all these battles I've won. My life has been a lot of battle. I was just a shepherd. That was nice. But then I've been fighting in battles for so long. I mean, ever since he was a teenager, he goes and defeats Goliath, and then he's a warrior in Saul's army. And then he's on the run from Saul, and then as soon as he finishes being on the run from Saul, he becomes king and he starts conquering people. He's been fighting his entire life, right? At this point, David, he's probably like 50 years old, right? Like he's probably a little bit older now. He's probably been king for probably 15, 20 years, and he probably feels pretty good about it. He's like, you know what? I've been fighting for long enough. I've earned one off season. You know, this is his moment where he's finally retiring. I've earned some time off. Just this one time. Joab, you go out there. You're still a young guy, but I'm gonna stay home. The issue is not that he stayed home; it's what he does when he stays home, right? Because, like I said, if he stayed home, that's cool. But like we're gonna see that there's other soldiers who are also here. But those men, what we're going to see them doing is that they are sleeping outside the palace because they are not going to be, like if their brothers are out fighting, they are not going to be enjoying the luxuries of being at home. Instead, they have other reasons for being home, and they're going to be faithful to their brethren who are fighting and not indulge themselves. Whereas David is doing the exact opposite. Right? Not only is he staying home, but he is ready to indulge himself. It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful. All right, paint the picture for me.
Goes on a walk.
You don't need to be too graphic with the picture you're painting, but
Okay. David's on a roof and he sees a nice woman. Probably 10 out of 10 from his balcony.
10 out of 10, yes.
From his roof.
And Ben was just with me in Israel a few months ago. And if you've ever been to Jerusalem, this, it sounds kind of weird to us whenever we read it here, but if you've been to Jerusalem, they have actually discovered the place where David's palace used to be at. And this is very easy to visualize because it's up on a hill, right? Jerusalem is set on a hill. And if you're the king, where are you going to put your house?
Very top of the hill.
At the top of the hill, right? That's where you're going to put it. And so you're on top of the hill, everything's below you, and David gets up one day, late in the evening, it's the springtime, right? If he's staying home, he's not going to be staying inside his house. No, he's going to be enjoying the fantastic spring weather in Jerusalem. It's beautiful. If you've ever, we were just there a little bit too early, but around now, in Israel, and especially once you get to April and May, it is just gorgeous, especially in Jerusalem, right? He is enjoying this weather. It's late afternoon. The sun's probably beginning to set. He gets up and goes for a stroll out on his balcony, just enjoying the life that he's been given while his men are out suffering. Keep in mind, you can't divorce what he's doing from his men out fighting, right? That is the setting here. It doesn't just start with verse 2. It starts by pointing out that David has men out there fighting and laying down their lives. And this is what he's doing at the same time. He should be out there with them. He gets up. He starts walking around on the balcony. He's looking out, and he looks, and he sees this woman. And behold, she is very beautiful. Now, it's one thing if you see it and look away, right? He can't control seeing it. But the implications here, he saw from the roof a woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful, right? He didn't just take a glance. It was like oh. And this was much more than just a glance, and it's going to become even more in just a second. What do y'all think about this scenario?
Not good. Turn out well. Not good.
Yeah, not good.
Not good at all.
People will have questions about Bathsheba here, right? Her name is, they haven't revealed her name yet. It's going to come in verse 3. But first off, it doesn't say that she was bathing on the roof. It says that he's on the roof and he sees her bathing. So she could have been on the roof, or she could have been in her house and maybe the blinds were open or something. Either way, probably not the wisest way to bathe if you know that the king is home and lives higher up than you. So ultimately, we don't know if she is complicit in what's about to happen or not. I have seen people take the extremes in both directions. I have seen some guys, usually this is how it works, I've seen some guys try to cast all the blame on Bathsheba. And they say, well, David would have never fell into sin if she hadn't been bathing. And that is just wrong. Because that implies that, that's not how it works. It was David's sinful heart that led him to do this, right? that is entirely on David, right? So I've seen some guys try to blame it entirely on Bathsheba, but then I have also seen some people, usually it's women, and they try to eradicate Bathsheba of all guilt as well, and they say, oh, well, David raped her. We don't know, right? It is possible that that is what's implying here. We just, that's not the point of the chapter. That's the main thing I'm trying to highlight here, right? Whether or not Bathsheba is complicit in this does not change the implications of the story. Because no matter what, whether or not David is simply committing adultery or physically assaulting a person, neither one is good, right? One is worse than the other, but it's not like, oh, well, he didn't physically assault her, so it's fine. No, neither one is good, right? He's a man after God's own heart. Neither one's acceptable. And ultimately, whether or not she's complicit isn't the main point of the story, right? The issue is David. That is the main point. And so I mainly just wanted to address that because I've seen people get really weird in this and they try to craft this entire narrative that actually distracts from the point of what the author's going for, right? Maybe Bathsheba was guilty, maybe not. Maybe she was trying to seduce him, maybe it was an accident. We have no idea.
Also,
yes.
why did she go back and tell him that she's pregnant if it was forced? Why would she go back to talk to him?
Well, I think it's mainly because they've got an issue.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that when we get there. But yeah, so personally, I lean towards the idea that maybe she was complicit in this, but it's not a stance it's not a hill I'm going to die on. I really, to me, either way, what he's doing is unspeakable. He gets up, he walks around, and he looks down, he looks from the roof, and he sees this girl bathing, and my oh my, does he like what he sees. And he keeps on looking, and keeps on looking, and keeps on looking. And then finally, David sent and inquired about the woman. There's that word inquired that we've noticed. Do you remember what the word inquired is in Hebrew?
Ask.
It's to ask. What is it? Shaul, right? I mainly highlight that because that's the name for Saul, right? Shaul, right? And we always saw Shaul not asking of God, not Shauling of God, whereas David is constantly inquiring of the Lord. David Shauled of God. But now he's not inquiring God about anything. Instead, he's inquiring a messenger. You'll notice that there's a lot of messengers in this story, right? That for some reason is a really big aspect of this story. A lot of messengers. And David sent and inquired about the woman. He was like, hey, who's that? Now, I don't know if David is just being a peeping Tom and telling somebody, or if he's like, hey, check that out. Who's that? I don't know. I don't know how that's going. But he calls somebody over, and he says, who is that? And something about how the messenger replies here seems like the messenger is kind of giving him a warning, right? Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? All right, so what's he saying?
He just essentially tells David, look, she's married.
Yeah, right? I mean, there's two things he highlights here, right? Who is this? Well, her name's Bathsheba, but more importantly, she's the daughter of Eliam, and she's the wife of Uriah. He reminds her that is one man's daughter, and that's another man's wife, right? Which is something that you should probably keep in mind if you're ever planning on doing something devious with another person you're not married to, right? That is somebody's child and somebody's spouse. They might not even be married yet, right? Here they're married. They might not be married yet, but they're somebody's spouse in the future. Keep that in mind, right? So this person's like, that's the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah, a.k.a. she's taken. And I don't know if that's what the messenger's trying to imply. I don't think that he would be so bold as to say that to the king. But there might have been a heavy-handed thing. They're like, that's, just so we're clear, that is not a single woman bathing that you see there. But also, real quick, let's talk about Eliam and Uriah. Do you know who these two people are?
I know Uriah, but I forgot who Eliam is.
So neither of them have been mentioned yet, but Eliam and Uriah are both two of David's mighty men, his Giborim. Right, that's what the word is in Hebrew. His Giborim. They are some of the men, whenever David was on the run from Saul, and a bunch of people, remember, like the outcast society came to him, and he trained them up to be soldiers. And then some of those became his like core group of like bodyguards and soldiers. Uriah and Eliam are two of those guys. Right? They are ones who came to David in his time of need and helped him out and were with him when he was on the run. These are not just random soldiers in David's army. These are two close companions of David. Bathsheba is Eliam's daughter, and also she's the granddaughter of Ahithophel, which is David's advisor. Right? So Ahithophel, we're going to read about him later in 2 Samuel. Ahithophel is the father of Eliam. Eliam is the father of Bathsheba. Right? So Eliam, one of David's close companions. Ahithophel, her granddad, is one of his advisors. And then Uriah was another one of his close soldiers. So you have to realize that what he's about to do is a very personal thing. This is not like him sinning against some guy he doesn't know. He knows Eliam very well. He knows Uriah very well. Both of these guys came and helped him in his time of need. Right? Whenever David was at his lowest, he was on the run from the current king of Israel. They came to him, and like the reason they did that is because they trusted him. Right? You have to realize, like, the context of it changes everything, right? Even if these were strangers, what he's doing is unspeakable. But he's not doing this to strangers. He's doing these to people who trusted him. Whenever there was a current king in Israel, David was on the run, these people looked to David and they said, David is such a good guy, we would rather be with him on the run than to dwell with Saul. These guys trusted David. And now David is looking at that. It also implies, Bathsheba is probably pretty young here. Which is also another dynamic. If David's like 50 at this point, and Bathsheba's that young, it makes things even more complicated, right? Because she's probably, if she's married to Uriah, so she's probably, she's past married age, for sure. But girls will get married in their teenage years. So she's still probably very young at this point. And so there's all these weird dynamics that go into this. That just make this very complex and creepy and not good. Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? It's also interesting that Uriah is a Hittite, because that's not an Israelite, right? A Hittite is a person, they came from, Turkey, right? They originally came from Turkey, and then I think they migrated, and for a while some of the Hittites were living in the region of Canaan. Right, so they were enemies of Israel. But Uriah apparently converted to Judaism, and he became a Yahweh follower. And we're going to see that. And Uriah in this story is actually a lot more like David would have been in the past. Right? So really, if you just take this story and put it back in 1 Samuel, and you took David's name and switched it with Saul's, and you took Uriah's name and switched it with David's, the story would read like it fit right in. Because David's acting a lot like Saul here, Uriah's acting a lot like David. This is just a whole mess. So Uriah is a Canaanite person who converted to Judaism and is a devout Jew now, who came to David in his time of need, and now David's about to do this unspeakable thing to him. So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. It's so quick. Right? This is crazy. Just because of how quick it is, right? It's not like, and David walked around and pondered, and he had this very deep discussion in his heart, and he wandered through the moral complexities of his choices, and he wondered whether he should do it. There's nothing like that, right? This person seems to be giving him like a warning, like, hey man, this girl is associated with some of your close buddies. Don't do something stupid. And the implications of David's actions are like, oh, I wasn't asking because I cared. I just wanted to know her name. Go get her for me. He sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Once again, was it consensual? Was it not? We don't know. Right? He's the king, and so no matter what, he can do what he wants. Right? And so if it was physical assault, he could do that. Right? Because he's the king, and the king's word is law. But just to try to be as gracious as David as possible, I'm hoping that it was something where they were both they both like were engaging in this. But either way, it's horrible. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Why is that significant? Like what's it talking about? Purifying herself from her uncleanness.
She's like, she knew she sinned against her husband and God, therefore she had to purify herself.
So this is actually, it's referring to what she had been doing prior to sleeping with David, right? It's
Is this maybe hinting at she was trying to maybe... Again, I'm not trying to go there, but
yeah.
I just can't help but speculate.
So whenever we talk about uncleanness in the Bible, what are we talking about? In the Old Testament specifically.
Is it impurity, mainly?
Impurity, but what do we mean by that? Like whenever you're, like, we're talking Leviticus stuff right here.
Like skin stuff?
It's stuff that's more physical, right? It's not, like, whenever we think unclean, we almost put like a moral baggage with it. It's more talking about just physical uncleanness. And so many people think that this is referring to her menstrual cycle, right? So it was her time of the month, and she had been bathing herself in her uncleanness, right? So she had just finished that cycle, and that's why she'd been bathing herself. Why is that significant?
Oh, because then in Leviticus it said you shouldn't
Yes.
be involved with a woman during that time.
Correct, but she just finished it. But what, like, just biologically speaking, what does it imply if she was just...
She just ovulated.
Which means that...
She's pregnant.
It means that she wasn't pregnant prior to this. Right?
Mm-hmm.
You see what I'm saying there? Because the whole issue that's going to arise here is that David's going to learn that she's pregnant, and he's like, I got to cover this up. It's important that she wasn't pregnant prior to this, because then it's like, oh, well, maybe that was Uriah's kid. And it's like, no, she was just, like, she just had her time of the month, which means that she was not pregnant prior, and now she's pregnant, and the only person she slept with in between is David. Right? So that's why that's more significant there. Because it's like, yeah, this is definitely your kid. Right? And that's what puts David in a dilemma. Because there's no concealing it now, right? It's not like, oh, let's just act like it's Uriah's. He's like, no, like, it's undeniably mine. Right? So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. David's doing this unspeakable thing, totally out of character for him. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Then she returned to her house. Right? So after this whole thing, she goes back to her house, and it seems like they're just going to try to move on as if it was nothing. And just for a moment of reality real quick. Whenever David was with her in verse 4, right, when he lay with her, do you think he was having a good time? Probably. Yeah. I mean, he literally saw this girl bathing, thought she was so smoking that he was like, call her over. He was probably having a fantastic time. But the rest of his life is going to be ruined by this moment. That's how sin is. Right? You're like, oh yeah, in the moment, it's great. And then, right? That's what we have to recognize. Like, that's the issue with David here. Later on, the prophet Nathan's going to confront David about this. And he's going to point out, look at all that God had given you. It's not like David had a lack of wives, right? We've seen this building up. Whenever I've talked about the chinks that we've seen in David's armor, women has been one of them, right? Every time that David made it to another step higher, we always see that he added to his harem, right? He had more wives, more concubines, more kids from those wives and concubines. Like, we saw this building up. And it's not like if you don't address the issue, it's not going to get fixed. And David never addressed the issue, so we shouldn't be surprised when something like this happens. Now it's just coming to the point where he can't hide it, and it's going to affect things. But he's had this as an underlying issue the whole way through, and then finally he embraces it in this way, and he's probably having a great time in the moment, but for the first time he's going to have to pay for the consequences of his actions. And the rest of his life is going to be like he's going to just be experiencing the consequences. And that sucks. But that's the effect of sin. Right? Does that mean that he wasn't forgiven for his sin? No. In chapter 12, he's going to repent and God's going to forgive him. But all because you're forgiven by God does not mean that you don't have to experience the consequences of those actions. Right? If a father is an alcoholic who goes and abuses his family, God can forgive that. However, there's probably going to be consequences where your family's not going to trust you as much. They're not going to be as likely to be as careful and loving. Like, there's going to be certain barriers that come from that, right? If a person runs their family into financial debt, can God forgive them? Absolutely. Does that mean that their kids are going to have a college fund? No, not necessarily, right? And so all because you're forgiven doesn't mean that the consequences are removed. And so David's having an awesome time in the bed with Bathsheba. But you have to ask, was it worth it? Right? Because everything that's going to come from it, it's like, ooh. And that's how sin is. And so whenever we read this, we have to realize, oh my gosh. And before we move on, I know we're going slowly through this, but it's because I want us to understand the weight of it. Rewind a little bit, and let's go back to 1 Samuel chapter 17. Actually, let's go back to 1 Samuel chapter 16. David, the little shepherd boy. You don't have to actually flip there. You don't need to flip there. 1 Samuel chapter 16. David is a little shepherd boy watching his father's flocks. One of his brothers runs up to him and says that the prophet is in town for some reason and that he wants to see him. David gets up, really confused. He walks over there. His family's all standing in a circle looking at him really weird-like. And then the prophet tells him to get on his knees. And the prophet begins to pour oil down his head, and it runs down his face. And the prophet says that you're going to be the future king of God, like God's people. Okay, fast forward some time. David walks onto this battlefield to deliver cheese to his brothers, and he sees this Goliath figure taunting the people of Israel. And this fury starts rising up inside of him, and he says, who does this uncircumcised Philistine think he is, that he defy the armies of the living God? Do you think that teenage David ever thought he could do something like this? No. Right? And it's just going to get worse. We haven't even seen the worst of it yet. Right? This is just the beginning of what David's doing wrong. The rest of the chapter is just going to be a continual spiral of David doing one thing after another that's worse and worse and worse. But right here, David's already doing something unspeakable, which tells me that we are also capable of horrible things. Because most of our study of 1 and 2 Samuel has been us just being blown away by how awesome David is. Even the last two chapters, David really starts off those chapters being like, who can I show kindness to today? And we're just like sitting there like, wow, I've never asked that in my life. Like, usually I'm so focused on serving myself, I've never thought and wondered like, I wonder who I could be loving to today. David was that guy. He was just miles ahead of us. Yet he's doing this, which tells me that this David, me, I am capable of horrible things that I can't even imagine. And it tells me that Sean is too, and Brienne is too, and every single one of y'all. We are not as strong as we think we are. And that's what we need to learn from David. Because David is doing the exact same thing that Eve did in the garden, right? Whenever Eve looked upon the fruit, after she talked with the serpent, it says that she saw that the fruit was pleasing to the eyes, and she saw that it was desirable to make one wise. There's a third thing. There's desires of the flesh, desires of the eyes, pride of life. She says that it was good to the taste, right? She saw that the fruit was good to the taste, it was pleasing to the eyes, and it was desirable to make one wise, right? The cravings of her belly, the cravings of her eyes, and the cravings of her own self. She saw those things and decided to eat the fruit. David does the same thing, right? His flesh desired to stay home. His flesh desired to be with this woman that his eyes desired. And it fed his own ego to call her over and take what was not his. This is exactly what the prophet Samuel told everybody would happen when a king was appointed. Right? What was the one word that Samuel repeated over and over and over whenever he told them about what would happen when a king was put in charge? Take. Right? He says, you want a king? He's going to take this, take that, take this, take that. He says that's what happens when somebody other than God's in charge. And that apparently is true even whenever a man after God's own heart is in charge. And the whole reason I highlight this, and the reason I'm wanting us to linger on this, is because we have to realize that as awesome as David is, he is not the person into whom we have to place our hope. Right? the author chooses to include this story because he wants you to realize that David is not the Messiah. Right? He is an awesome guy, but he's still one of us. He is not the one who's going to crush the serpent. He is not the one in whom all the world will be blessed. He is simply a man who chose to chase after God's heart, but still a man. And even the best man is a man at best. Right? So David, he's cool. We can learn from him, but also we can learn from his mistakes. But he's not the person in whom you place your hope. We're still waiting for that person to show up, and unfortunately he's not going to show up for another 1,000 years after David. But he's already been promised. Right? That happened in chapter 7. She returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent to David and told David, I am pregnant. All right. So Amanda asked the question earlier, if she wasn't complicit in this, why would she tell David about this?
That's a really good question.
Why would she tell him? Like, hypothetical scenario, let's say that he did force himself upon her. Why would she still communicate this?
Make it to make it
To get the support from him, like money.
Okay.
He's the king, so he has all the power.
Yeah. He's the king, he's got all the power, and even if he forced himself upon her, he's still got something to clean up. Because it's like, hey, I know that you thought you could get away with this, but you're not going to be able to. I just got off my cycle, which means that I wasn't pregnant when Uriah left, and now I'm pregnant. And so if you thought this was something that you could conceal and get away with, we've got an issue on our hands. Right? And so whether or not he forced himself upon her or not, this is something that she's communicating. Once again, I lean towards the idea that he did force himself upon her. I don't know. It doesn't matter. The thing that matters is that David is going to go into full-out panic mode right now. Because for him, he thought that this was just like, a little, afternoon delight. Right? He just got out on the balcony. He's like, oh, wow, she's hot. Called her over, slept with her, had a good time. And he's like, all right, see you later. Probably not. He deleted her number off his phone and never called her again. That's what he's planning on doing. Right? He thought like it was just going to be a one-time thing and, it was cool. Maybe next time Uriah went off to war, they'd hang out again. Netflix and chill. I don't know. He, this is how he wanted it to go. But now, there's no way to conceal this. And he gets the message, and this is time afterwards, right? This is weeks, if not months later. He gets this message. Once again, messengers going back and forth, back and forth. And he receives this message, and says, I'm pregnant. And all of a sudden, David has to confront his sin. Because for a while, he's been multiplying wives and concubines. And he even took someone's wife before. Remember? He took Michal. Right? Because remember, Michal was Saul's daughter and was originally his wife, but then she'd been given to somebody else, but then he took her back. So he's even taken somebody's wife before. But at least he had a claim to her. This one, he has no claim to. Right? And not only that, he's betrayed his comrades. He is their leader. They're out there laying their lives down for his kingdom. And he has taken their daughter and their wife and has slept with her. And now he can't conceal it. So David's going to go into panic mode. And he's like, oh, crud. And we have to realize that David is typically very savvy. And he's typically very good at thinking on the fly. But right here, it doesn't seem like he's ever been in a situation like this before. He's usually faithful David. And he's not always the best at he's not been in a situation where he's trying to actively conceal sin because usually he'll just repent and move on. But he's not thinking about God in this story, right? He's thinking about himself and he's thinking about his lust. And so what he's going to do is he's going to try to conceal it. So we move on to the next part of the story. Take it away, Sean.
So David sent word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab was doing and how the people were doing and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. And Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king, But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. When they told David Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, "Have you not come from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah dwell in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing." Then David said to Uriah, "Remain here today also, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. And David invited him, and he ate in his presence and drank, so that he made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his lord, but he did not go down to his house.
Okay.
Wow.
So, what's David's plan?
He's trying to get Uriah drunk to go to his house to think he had with his wife.
Yeah. He's trying to basically convince Uriah that the child is his. Right? This is David's attempt. Right? Like, he's like, okay, so at least he doesn't immediately jump to murder. But you know what he also doesn't immediately jump to? Repentance. Confession. Right? He's determined to conceal his sin. And I wish that it stopped at this slide, but it doesn't. But with each slide that we're going through, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. So here we have it. So David sent word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." Seems kind of weird if you don't know where the story's heading. You're like, oh, like you're kind of hopeful at first, right? It's like, oh, maybe he's asking for Uriah. They're going to sit down and he's going to be like, "Uriah, I'm so sorry. I messed up. Here's what I did. Could you ever forgive me?" And maybe Uriah will forgive him, maybe he won't, but at least it'll be out there. David can repent. That's what you're hoping for. But that's not what's going to happen, is it? No. Instead, David's not planning on confessing. In which case you might wonder, well, then why would you invite Uriah? I mean, dude, you just slept with his wife and you're wanting to hang out with him now? Yeah, because he's got an ulterior motive. And he's trying to be sneaky. And David, to be fair, he's all right at concealing his sin, but he's out of his wheelhouse, right? He's not used to this, right? He's used to being a man of integrity, not a man of duplicity. "Send me Uriah the Hittite," and Joab sent Uriah to David. And once again, notice, I don't know what to do with this, just the messengers, right? There's messengers everywhere in this story, right? He sends a messenger, "Hey, who's that lady?" Okay, and then he sends a messenger to her, and then she comes to him, and they sleep together, and then a messenger sends him the letter, and then now he sends a message to Joab, and there's just so many messengers going back and forth.
Seems to contribute to the secrecy thing.
Probably, yeah. It's very it's almost like a subliminal message that adds to the duplicity of all of it, right? It's there's no direct interactions. It's always working through middlemen because it's trying to conceal things. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab was doing and how the people were doing and how the war was going.
Small talk.
What's that?
Bunch of small talk.
Small talk. All right, let's step into the perspective of Uriah for a second. What do you think he's thinking?
He's thinking, David probably just wants an update and he's going to send me back.
Yeah, he's probably thinking, yeah, David, he just wants an update on things. If I'm Uriah though, I'm probably wondering, why did you need me to tell you this? Right? I mean, you literally could have just asked a messenger for this information. So it is kind of weird, right? And I don't know what Uriah's thinking here, but it is very strange. But David, notice what he's doing. This is so messed up. He's acting buddy-buddy with Uriah. "Uriah, my friend, my comrade, we go way back. Come take a seat. Let's have a banquet. Tell me, how's Joab doing? All right, how are the people doing? How's the war going? Tell me all the details." Oh, he's just trying to calm him down, make it seem normal. It's not every day you get an audience with the king. I mean, back in the day, him and David probably were chummy, but now that David's a king, they barely get to ever talk. "Oh, come hang out with me," and they're just having small talk. And there's something just sinister about this. It makes you just feel gross. The fact that we know what David's done. And David currently knows that Uriah is right across the street from them, right? I mean, like, the palace and their house can't be that far apart. Which also tells you that Uriah then must have been pretty close, the fact that he's living that close to the king, right? So Bathsheba is just like a few paces away, pregnant with David's child. And David knows what he's done. And he is just talking to Uriah and just like, I don't know, there's something nasty about this interaction. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab was doing and how the people were doing and how the war was going. I always like the repetition that you see in like Hebrew literature. Like they're just like, it just the repetition that kind of like it emphasizes the nastiness of it all, right? It's like it just keeps going. Then David said to Uriah, right now he gets to the main point of what he was really trying to accomplish. Go down to your house and wash your feet. What does that imply?
Go home and relax. Enjoy yourself.
Relax. Yeah, go home. You don't need to hang out here. Go home. Wash your feet. Why would you wash your feet?
You just got done with war.
Got done with war, but also Jewish people were very cleanly. They would always wash their feet before they went to bed. And this is a polite way of saying, go home and go to bed. But who's waiting at home, and who's going to be sharing a bed with Uriah? Bathsheba. Right? It's a polite way of saying, go home and enjoy your wife. Right? He's not going to outright say that because that would be crude, but that's what he's implying. Go home, wash your feet. Wink. You've earned it. Sounds like the war's going great. Just go indulge yourself for a little bit. But here's the irony. Uriah is not going to sleep with his wife. David was more than willing to sleep with Uriah's wife. That is the horrific thing about this whole scenario, right? Like, David is going to try so hard just to get this guy to sleep with his wife, and this guy's not going to do it, even though the guy probably wants to so badly. I mean, apparently his wife's a smoke show, right? I mean, he's probably like, yeah, I've been wanting to be with my wife this entire time. But he's not going to do that. David had no problem. He's like, dude, I'll sleep with your wife again if you don't want. Like David is just, this is just problematic in so many ways. David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. And Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. All right, so Uriah leaves, and what does David send behind?
A present.
A present. What's the present? I don't know, but I imagine that it was, maybe some food, maybe some things to set the mood, maybe some scented candles, I don't know. He sent him things to encourage him to sleep with his wife. That is David's whole goal here, because if he can get Uriah to sleep with Bathsheba, there wasn't Ancestry.com back then, right? They couldn't take a paternity test. As long as the baby comes looking out like a Jewish man or somebody from, or somewhat Hittite, something in there, oh yeah, that's your kid, right? He just wants it to pass as Uriah's child. That's the whole thing. Conceal his sin. As long as he can get Uriah to sleep with Bathsheba, nobody ever has to know what he's done, except for him and Bathsheba and the messengers who I can guarantee you have been gossiping about this the entire time. They've been like, oh my gosh, David has gone off the deep end. Yes?
And God. God
And
saw
God.
the whole thing.
But David's not thinking about God right now, is he? He's not thinking about that at all. Right? And as soon as Nathan confronts him in chapter 12, that's going to be the first thing he thinks about. I have sinned against the Lord. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord and did not go down to his house. So how does Uriah respond?
I didn't really want to go to my house.
Well, it's not that he didn't want to.
He's just going to be disciplined. He's like, my men are out there fighting. Why
Yes.
am I going to enjoy myself?
Yeah, he's going to be disciplined. Right? So instead, he goes outside the king's house and sleeps with the servants. What a humble man. Here he's been invited by the king. Like, Uriah has every reason to be tempted to go sleep with his wife. Right? He has been given a special invite from the king to spend time with the king one-on-one. And not only that, but the king himself, whose word is law, gave him explicit permission to go home and wash his feet. Right? I mean, like, the king is basically begging him to go sleep with his wife. Right? right? And he's missed his wife. He's been off at war for who knows how long. They've been, there's probably nothing he wants more than to just go do exactly that. But he's a man of honor and dignity and respect, and he won't do it. When they told David Uriah to not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, have you not come from a journey? Why'd you not go down to your house? He's like, well, let me ask a little more. He's like, hey, Uriah. Once again, he's playing like a friend. He's like, dude, no, I'm serious. Go home. He's trying to play it off like he's got his best interest at heart. Dude, you've had a long journey. You've been off at war. I know that you want to sleep with the servants. I know. It's fine. I'm the king. Listen to me. Just go. It's okay. It's been a long journey. Just go home. It's fine. David, in this instance, is kind of taking the role of the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Right? He's trying to speak into the guy's, into his ears, being like, yeah, did God really say that? No. He's like, oh, no, it's fine for you to go home. Go sleep with your wife. And technically, would there be anything inherently sinful for Uriah to go do that?
No, because he's married.
That's his wife. Yeah. He's home, might as well. But for Uriah, it would be sinful. Because for him, his brethren are out there fighting. Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah dwell in booths, and my lord and Joab and the servants of my lord are camping and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and drink and to lie with my wife? Who does this sound like?
David early on.
David, earlier, right? The ark of God is dwelling in a tent, and I dwell in this house. Shall I not build a house for the Lord? This is how David used to be. He looked at the bad situation other people found themselves in and almost felt guilty about the privilege that he experienced. And he said, how can I show kindness to people? Uriah is doing the same thing. Who did he probably learn this from? David. Right? He learned this character from David, most likely. Because this is the David that he followed in the wilderness, right? The David who was willing to suffer for the sake of his fellow men. And he says, King, why are you so shocked that I wouldn't indulge myself? The ark of God is dwelling in a booth, and all of my men are suffering. How could I possibly enjoy my own wife? At this point, this is a clear opportunity for David to confess. Because how David should hear this is, this man is not willing to enjoy his own wife, but I was willing to enjoy his wife, despite what he was going through. This man is denying himself what he has every right to, and I wasn't even willing to deny myself that which I had no right to. This is a convicting moment where David should immediately confess, and he has been given every opportunity to confess, but he's not going to do it. And then notice what Uriah says. As you live, and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing. He says, David, as long as you're alive, I would never, ever consider betraying my men in such a way. King, surely you would know this, right? I learned this from you, because you care so deeply for us. You took care of us when we were in need. And we met you in the cave of Adullam, and you trained us into men. You taught us this mentality. How could I do that? As long as you live, I could never. David has committed adultery, which, according to the Jewish law, what's the punishment of adultery?
Death.
Death. So, technically, David deserves to die here. Right? But does Uriah know that? No. Some people speculate that he might have an inkling. I don't think that Uriah knows, but some people, some of the way that Uriah has worded stuff here, some people suggest that maybe he's catching on. Because David's coming off a little too heavy-handed. Because David's like, go home, sleep with your wife. No, I'm fine. No, go home, sleep with your wife. As long as you live, I would never do that to my fellow men. It's almost like, why? What have you done? I don't think that's what Uriah is saying here, but that's how some people read it. I think Uriah is just the innocent victim in all this. Well, no matter what, he'd be the innocent victim, whether he's picking up on it or not. If he is picking up on it, that's even more heartbreaking. Because that means that he knows what's happening, and he's still just being faithful. Right? But no matter what, this is just, it's horrible. Uriah is like a pinnacle of just like virtue right here. And he's a Hittite. He's not even Jewish, right? Like he's a convert, right? And he is being faithful and devoted to David's men. He is being what a king should be, right? This is how David used to be, right? He's like, no, I would never do this. I would suffer for the sake of my men. And David, he's the king. He should be out there fighting. But instead, he chose to stay home. And he had other men fight his battle. He stayed home, did nothing. Danger of idleness, right? This is my own life as well. I have noticed that I typically sin more when I have less things to keep me busy. I've noticed whenever I start getting lazy and start getting idle and start sitting around, distractions abound, and I will just fall into sin. Whereas if you're staying busy and you're staying focused on serving God and fulfilling what God has called you to do, it's easier to not sin because you actually have purpose driving you. David should have been doing his God-given mission to serve the people and be out at the front lines. He stayed home, he was idle, and he got to actually look around and indulge himself. Uriah is being given that opportunity, but he's like, no. I might be home, but I'm still on duty. So I'm going to sleep with the servants because I am a servant. And David, as long as you're alive, I am not going to go sleep with my wife right now. Yikes. Then David said to Uriah, remain here today also, and tomorrow I'll send you back. All right, so what does David do there?
Stay another night.
Stay another night. He's like, this is not working. You can see David buying himself some time. Right? He's like, okay, I need to convince this guy to do what I want him to do. And it's just so terrible. Because you have a guy, like David's literally being the serpent right now. Like that's what he's doing. Because he should be convicted by this guy's integrity and self-discipline. And he should be like, Uriah, I was going to try to conceal this from you. But you being such a faithful person has made me I have to confess. I've slept with your wife. She's pregnant. Like he should confess, right? Because that's what this should affect him with. Like he should be so affected by this that he's like that. But instead, he sees this man being so self-disciplined, and his only response is, I guess I'll have to try harder tomorrow to convince him to do otherwise. He's going to have to convince him to go against his better conviction, better judgment, and do what Uriah obviously deems as sinful. That is horrible. Like, this is so wicked and so terrible for David to do. Yet, this is what happens. David's not thinking about Uriah at all. He's not thinking about Bathsheba. He's not thinking about Eliam. He's not thinking about Joab. He's not thinking about his men. David is thinking about one person only, and who is it? Himself. He is not impressed by Uriah's integrity. If anything, he's annoyed by it. He's looking at it and he's like, this guy will not give me a break. I just want you to sleep with your wife so you don't have to know that I already did it. Right? This is just so many levels of wrong.
He's having to drag other people into sin to conceal the sin.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what it's doing. And like whenever we think that sin only affects us, we're stupid. And we're just deceiving ourselves. Right? Because sin does affect other people. And that's what he's doing. Because Uriah, it wouldn't be inherently sinful for him to sleep with his wife. But given Uriah's conviction about it, it would be sinful. Right? Because Uriah is trying to do the loving thing, and it goes against his conscience. Right? And Paul talks about this plenty when you get to the New Testament. Right? Anything not done in faith is sin. Right? And so there's nothing inherently wrong with sleeping with your wife, but given Uriah's conscience in regards to it, it would be sinful because it would be an unloving act towards his fellow men. And David is just trying so hard to get Uriah to let go of his self-discipline. This is the same guy who has always been self-disciplined. Like, he wouldn't even touch a hair on Saul's head, even though Saul was chasing him down, because he says, this is the Lord's anointed. How could I do that? So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. So he doesn't just stay one day, he stays 2 days. which I guess there's extra story there where David tried again and it didn't work. And so the third day arrives. And David invited him, and he ate in his presence and drank so that he made him drunk. You can imagine the scene. Uriah probably can't imagine his good fortune, right? I mean, he's just like getting to hang out with the king, and for some reason the king just wants to hang out with him so much. It's like, what, is the king lonely back here at home? Like you really have to wonder what's going on in Uriah's head here. But he just keeps getting invited back, and David just seems to really want to hang out with him. And then they're hanging out, and Uriah's here, David's here, and every time Uriah finishes his goblet, David just pours him some more, and he's like, wow, we're eating fancy tonight, this is great. Mephibosheth's probably sitting over there being like, wow, David's being really nice to Uriah. But this is horrible, right? And you have to wonder also what the messengers are thinking during all this. Because there are other people who are aware of what David's been doing here, right? There was somebody who had to go get Bathsheba from Uriah's house and bring her over to David. And probably who had to walk her back home afterwards. Right? There are people who know what's going on. And those people are probably now watching David hang out with Uriah. And they're trying to figure out what his game is. And they're probably picking up on it. And I imagine that this gossip is just spreading throughout the area. Which makes me think maybe Uriah would know by then. I have no idea. But this is just horrific. David's getting him drunk. Why is he getting him drunk?
He wants him to slip up.
Slip up, yeah. Yeah, lower his inhibitions. Sober Uriah is faithful. Drunk Uriah? Who knows?
See about that.
Drunk Uriah is like, you know what? I think sleeping with my wife sounds like a great idea. So you don't know. David's like, maybe we can get him to slip up. Which, ironically, I mean, drunkenness is a sin. And so he has guided Uriah into sin. But then notice this. So David invited him. He ate in his presence and drank so that he made him drunk. And in the evening, he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of who? His Lord. Right? The servants of his Lord. But he did not go to his house. Even drunk Uriah is self-disciplined and faithful. This is wild, because it's not like Uriah's wife is like an ugly hag. It's Bathsheba. Like, this is literally the one person, like, if you were to, like just talk to somebody who's never opened a Bible in their life and say, who is probably, like, when you think of attractive people in the Bible, who's the first person you think of, people will be like, probably Bathsheba. Like, literally, the reason why she's famous is because she was able to cause the man of God to fall into sin. Right? So it's not like his wife is unappetizing to him. It's not like he's like, oh, I just would never want to see one. No, of course he wants to. But even in his drunken state, he's inebriated, he can't think straight. Even then, he is so self-disciplined to deny himself the pleasure which David already indulged in. David wasn't drunk when he did this. David was just sinful. Right? That, like, just the contrast between these is so, it's really ridiculous whenever you just highlight the differences between these two guys right now. And it's scary because we've seen David, we've never seen David like this, right? This is just like a totally different side of David, which once again scares me in regards to us, because we can see each other in Bible study every Tuesday night, and we get to see the, hopefully, other chapter version of David's in each other. But, I don't know. We need to... This part of David is lingering inside all of us as well. And that's why we need to read this, so that we don't succumb to it. It also just makes me really sad that it says the servants of his Lord. Because Uriah, he's not just doing this to be faithful to his fellow men. He's doing this to be faithful to David. Because he is, above all, a soldier in David's army to support David's kingdom. And so, even though David is telling him to go indulge himself and his wife, out of service to David, he is saying no. Because he says, I'm your soldier. I would not do that while I am on duty. And you might have invited me home, but I am still a soldier. And until my fellow men are back home, I'm not going to enjoy my wife like that. There's just, the contrast is ridiculous. Moving on. Go for it, Sean.
In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter he wrote, "Set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, so that he may be struck down and die." And as Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant men. And the men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite also died. Then Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting. And he instructed the messenger, "When you have finished telling all the news about the fighting to the king, then, if the king's anger arises, and he says to you, 'Why did you go so near the city to fight? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, the son of Jerubasheth? Did not a woman cast an upper millstone on him from the wall, so that he died at Thebes? Why did you go so near the wall?' Then you shall say, 'Your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also.'"
I think Joab was catching on.
Oh yeah.
He knows something's up.
Oh yeah. And the sad part is that Joab probably doesn't care. Because one thing, like back in which chapter was it? Chapter 10, right? Last week.
Mm-hmm.
Joab was actually looking pretty good.
Yeah.
But that's like the only chapter where Joab actually comes across looking good. Every other chapter, what have I said is our principle when it comes to Joab? You don't mess with Joab, right? Joab is the guy you go to if you want a dirty job done, right? He is ruthless. He's the Baba Yaga, yeah. That's a John Wick reference for those of y'all who don't know. There's a reason why he sends this to Joab. Joab is the commander of David's army, and there's a reason why. Because Joab's effective on the battlefield. Because Joab is willing to do what it takes to get the job done. And David knows that. And it's also David's nephew. Right? This is just horrific. So, David has had multiple opportunities to repent. Multiple opportunities to confess. Multiple times, Uriah has demonstrated himself to be a man of integrity and discipline and valor. And rather than confessing anything, David decides to take his sin a step further. If he cannot convince Uriah that the child is his, and if he cannot convince Uriah to sleep with his wife, then David is left with only one other option to conceal his sin. And what is it? Get rid of her. Right? And then he can take Bathsheba in as his wife, and he can look like the valiant king who took care of his man's bride in the wake of his death. Right? Oh, what a great king. Look at David. Whenever Uriah died, he took Bathsheba in as one of his own to make sure that she didn't die a widow. This is horrific, right? How is this the man after God's own heart, right? That's why we need to get to chapter 12, because chapter 12, you'll see how this is still a man after God's own heart. Chapter 11, though, not looking good. So we're on the third day now, or I guess it's the morning of the fourth day. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of who? Uriah.
He said he had his own death note with him.
Yep. This is so messed up, right? He has a scroll that says, make sure Uriah dies. And Uriah is the one who hands the message to Joab. That is jacked up stuff. That is messed up. This is a whole nother level. This is top tier villain territory stuff. Imagine they made a movie that was just about the David and Bathsheba story and you didn't know the rest of the story of David. This guy, you would hate his guts, right? He is horrible. This is some sadistic stuff. It'd be one thing. It'd already be bad enough if he just sent it by another messenger. But instead, he hands it to Uriah. And also, once again, David, not very good whenever it comes to concealing himself. You can tell he's just out of his he's not used to this. What's that?
Out of his mojo.
Yeah, he's out of his mojo. Because what if Uriah read this? If Uriah's he's going over there and he's I wonder what this says. Oh, it's well, what the heck? So either way, this is not a wise move, right? There's just so many different ways this could go bad, And David's trying to keep it a secret, but notice that the more and more he tries to keep it a secret, the more and more the word is getting out. Because now Joab's going to know that something happened, and then it's going to be really convenient whenever Joab sees that Uriah's wife is pregnant by David, and he starts doing the math, and he's like, David, according to the math, it seems like she had to get pregnant before Uriah died. So, more and more people are being brought into this. And as David's, he's just not good at concealing it, right? He's trying his darndest. He just can't do it because he's not used to it, right? There are some people who are experts at concealing sin, and David, to his credit, is not. That's probably the one encouraging part about this whole story, is that David is not perfect at concealing sin, because it shows, okay, good. Yeah. At least this means that he doesn't regularly engage in ventures like this. He's out of his wheelhouse.
Also, I think something that's like really sad about it too is the fact that if what's his name? Uriah, if he would have went back home to Bathsheba, then he wouldn't have sent that letter to him. So if he would have fallen into sin, he wouldn't have killed him.
Yeah.
But if you think about David before, like, it didn't even take necessarily someone sinning for him to kill them. Like, if someone came and just like talked bad about God or talked bad about Saul, he would kill them.
Yeah.
But now he's killing someone for not sinning, which is kind of weird.
Yeah, Uriah is the Jesus of the story, right? He is murdered because of his sinlessness, right? He is so filled with integrity that he has to die. Because if he just went and slept with his wife, that's all it would take, right? Just one lapse in judgment, he would have lived. But instead, he was so filled with integrity and so determined to be faithful to David and to his fellow men that David decided to kill him. This guy shouldn't be getting promoted to the top of David's army because he's an amazing soldier. But instead, David's going to have him killed. In the letter he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him that he may be struck down and die. That's horrible. I mean, this guy has just demonstrated that he is like probably the most noble warrior in your army, and now you are intentionally setting him up to be killed. He's not thinking about Uriah. Like, this guy has been with him since he was like on the run from Saul. Like, they've known each other for like 30 years. And now he's just treating him like a pawn. Nobody goes into battle. Like, it's just terrible warfare too. Like, this is so inconsiderate. Draw back from him so he may be struck down and die. And notice this. Joab doesn't entirely listen to David's commands. And as Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant men. Okay, so where does he assign Joab?
With some of the best men.
Well, some of the best men, specifically speaking about like the
hardest fighting.
Yeah, the hardest fighting, right? So that part he's doing, right? So as Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant men, and the men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite also died. So you'll notice that Uriah isn't the only person who died, is he? Mm-hmm. No, other men died. Why is that?
Even better cover up.
Better cover up, right? Joab's like, I think I get the message, right? Because guess what? If Uriah is out there and like Joab's being like, hey guys, once Uriah looks like he's about to get killed, everybody else draw back. Now everybody else knows that something's going on here. But Joab, he gets the message. He's like, we want to cover up. I got you. Okay. The unfortunate thing is that means that there's got to be more casualties, because that means less people have to be in on it, and so it has to look more natural, right? So Uriah can't be the only one to die. Other people have to die for this as well. And so not only is Uriah the innocent victim, but all these other guys are victims too. And we don't know their names. We don't know their stories. They probably had wives. They probably had children as well. They were killed in battle, unnamed in the testament of Scripture, all because of David's sin. But he had a really good night sleeping with her. So it was worth it, right? Uriah's dead. These men are dead. But man, those few minutes of ecstasy in that palace bedroom. Now this is horrible. Joab was besieging the city. He assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant men. And you gotta wonder what Uriah is thinking here. Is he realizing that something's fishy? Or is he thinking that his time with David went really well and he's been promoted and he's being sent to fight against the best men?
The second option.
We don't know. Either way, ultimately it doesn't matter. Because no matter what Uriah thinks, he's going to be faithful to David. And even if he is aware of the fact that David, like even if the whole time he was aware of the fact that David sinned against him, he was still being faithful to him. Right? That's the whole point. Uriah is simply a faithful man. And he's a man under authority who's going to submit to the word of the king. So whether he knew or not, doesn't matter. The men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Notice it doesn't say the soldiers of David, it says the servants of David. It's highlighting the fact that these are people who serve David. But ultimately, what is a king supposed to do? Supposed to do.
Serve the people.
Serve the people. Protect the people. He's supposed to be serving them. He's supposed to be out in this battle with them. But instead, they're serving him, and because they're serving David, they get killed. To conceal David's sin. They don't get killed because the battle was simply too hard. They get killed because Joab pulled back and let them die. That was it. It wasn't like, oh no, the battle was super difficult, the Ammonites were winning. No, they could have done better. Joab knows how to win a battle. Instead, he had received a command from David. And so, hey guys, pull back real quick. Oh no, Uriah, oh well. Win some, you lose some. Uriah the Hittite also died. That's just so sad. Like just that phrase. Uriah the Hittite also died. Part of you is kind of just like hoping that somehow Uriah makes it out of this, but he doesn't. Which is just the tragic story. You know, like, if this were a movie, you'd probably just get up and walk out of the movie theater right now. Because Uriah is the hero of this chapter. And he just gets brutally murdered. And you're like, worst story ever. But then you realize that the villain of the story is actually the protagonist. And you're like, oh my. This is scary. Then Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting. More messengers. And he instructed the messenger, when you have finished telling all the news about the fighting to the king, then, if the king's anger rises, and if he says to you, why did you go so near the city to fight? Did you not know they would shoot that they would shoot from the wall? Okay, so Joab seems to be anticipating some anger from David. Why would David be mad?
Because there were other people who died. He just wanted one person dead. That's my thoughts.
That's part of it. But why specifically? Like, what does he list out here as his reasoning?
He's thinking, why did you come up with this stupid battle plan?
Yeah. David is a man of war. He's fought battles before. And apparently what Joab did was not the smartest battle move. Because if you're laying siege to a city, you know what you don't do? Like, you fight the people, but you don't fight all the way to the gate and to the wall. Why do you not fight all the way to the gate and to the wall?
They shoot down.
Yeah. They're standing on top and they can just shoot down at you and you're pretty much defenseless. Right? So you can fight really close to them, but unless you are just like guaranteed to be captured in the city, you're not going to get that close. But here David, Joab knows how to win a battle. They're not used to losing battles. And David hears news that they've lost a battle. And David only instructed for Uriah to die. Right? So David's not expecting massive casualties, but Joab knows how to cover something up. And so he says, the king's not going to be happy when he hears about what happened here. He's going to be angry, and he's going to be mad about this happening. But then he references a story. Who killed Abimelech, the son of Jerubasheth? Did not a woman cast an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died at Thebes? Do you remember that story?
It was in Judges.
It was. This is a long time ago. Abimelech. Was he a good or bad guy? Bad. Abimelech. He was the son of, do you remember?
He wasn't Gideon's son, was he?
Yep, son of Gideon. Remember? Abimelech, my father's king?
Yeah.
Yeah, Abimelech. He was the son of Gideon. And he wasn't an official judge, but he kind of went out there and declared himself a king. And he started conquering everything. And he started taking everything. And he drew up close to the wall. And then the greatest irony is that a woman is the one who destroyed him. Do you see the parallels that the narrator might be drawing by including Joab's reference to this story? You have a man who abuses his power and is ultimately destroyed by a woman for drawing too close to danger. Right? That's exactly what David does, right? He's a king who, like, Abimelech was a self-proclaimed king, but David is acting a lot like Abimelech. So Joab is drawing the parallel to, like, he's saying that David is going to quote this story and talk, like, make the parallel in regards to the battlefield. But some people look at this like maybe Joab is making a veiled reference back to David. And he's including this story to be like, David? This is about a woman, isn't it? Because David is acting a lot like Abimelech, which is not somebody you want to be like, because Abimelech is not a hero in his story either. But there's a point behind all this, and Abimelech was killed because he got too close to the wall, right? To where literally a woman drops a millstone on him, and do you remember how Abimelech died?
He gets like his armor bearer to like kill him because he doesn't want to be killed by a woman.
Yeah, he's like, please kill me so that they can't say I was killed by a woman. Ironically, Joab still kind of references him as being killed by a woman, so it didn't really work out for Abimelech. But yeah, so he says a woman was his downfall, and he died. So, who killed Abimelech's son Jerubbesheth? Did not a woman cast an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died at Thebez? Why did you go so near the wall? So he says David's going to be mad because David knows military strategy, and he knows that this was not the wisest military decision. Because yes, we did get too close to the wall, and he's going to be royally ticked off, and he has every right to do so, but messenger, I've got the secret antidote to David's fury. You have to simply say one phrase. You ready for the phrase? Your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. That's it. He says David's going to be really ticked because a lot of people died, and David does not like losing battles. But if you say this one thing, it'll calm David down. Uriah's dead. Now this messenger's probably like, that's kind of weird. I mean, seems like that would make him angrier because like Uriah is one of David's like mighty men. Why? Like maybe he's thinking that David will get like somber or something. I don't know, but not looking good. Last slide. Go for it, Sean.
So the messenger went and came and told David all that Joab had sent him to tell. The messenger said to David, "The men gained an advantage over us and came out against us in the field, but we drove them back to the entrance of the gate. Then the archers shot at your servants from the wall. Some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also." David said to the messenger, "Thus you shall say to Joab, do not let this matter displease you, for the sword devours now one and now another. Strengthen your attack against the city and overthrow it, and encourage him." When the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she lamented over her husband. And when the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord.
Dun, dun, dun. That really is a good cliffhanger, isn't it? It's like, oh. It's like God hasn't been mentioned in the chapter at all until the very end.
The last word,
Yeah. But the thing David had done displeased Yahweh. It's like, oh no. Yahweh has entered the chat. It's like, oh, this is not good. Okay. What sticks out to y'all here?
There's a phrase that's repeated, not referenced, but came up again.
What phrase?
The sword devouring.
The sword devours.
How much longer shall the sword devour?
Oh, yes. Yeah, because that was Joab said that back in chapter 4, I think.
It was a chapter when the skirmish thing happened.
Yeah. How long shall the sword devour?
The Abner fight.
Yeah. You see what I mean whenever I say that each slide David becomes more and more slimy? Like, he just gets worse and worse and worse with each passing slide. So, we've got another messenger, and finally the guy is going to relay the message to David. I think he wisely does not include the Abimelech thing, because I imagine that David might pick up on that subtle message. That's another thing. The messengers, they're constantly being told to do stuff, but very rarely do they actually, like, very rarely are they demonstrated as actually having fully, like...
What about the gossip between them?
The gossip? Oh, yeah. You know that this is, like, that's the thing. David's trying to conceal it, but more and more people are getting roped into it, and his reputation's ruined. Like, there's no way that this is not being heard by everybody. Right? Which is just sad. Because not only is David, you have to realize, David is not simply sinning against God. He's not simply sinning against Uriah and Bathsheba. He's sinning against the entire nation. Because he, as their king, has a responsibility to lead them in the ways of God. And keep in mind, he is the one who danced before the ark of the Lord whenever it was coming into Jerusalem. Right? He has established himself as a religious leader. Right? People look to him for moral and spiritual guidance. And to see him do something like this is probably going to wreck a lot of their faith. And they're going to be very disheartened by that. You know, we've seen stuff like this, right? Oh, if that's what a Christian looks like, I don't want to be a Christian. Right? Because we have that responsibility. Like, people are going to look to... Like, if you are very clear about the fact that you're a Christian, people are going to scrutinize you and look at you. And that's part of the deal, right? I'm not going to say, ooh, don't make... No, you need to live publicly as a Christian. People are going to look at you, but that means you're held to a higher standard. And people are going to be extra critical. David? You don't even have to be that critical to see what he's doing wrong. Right? And so, this is problematic. So the messenger went and came and told David. Right? I like that you're just like, went and came and told David. You see, like, all the steps of the process. He went, he came, he told David all that Joab had sent him to tell. The messenger said to David, the men gained an advantage over us. Right? How he's presenting it's actually a much more positive light of it. Like, it's not that Joab was foolish. It's that the other army was just doing so well. Right? The men gained an advantage over us and came out against us in the field, but we drove them back to the entrance of the gate. Right? He's making it sound like it was a really good fight. Then the archers shot at your servants from the wall. Some of the king's servants are dead. And your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also.
It's weird that he's so specific about the one person.
Yeah.
You don't know what's going on.
Yeah. I mean, if everybody else is listening to this, like, do you know why he mentioned Uriah? That was weird.
Sounds like he's trying to rub it in.
Yeah. But, so he tells him, Uriah the Hittite's dead also. And now comes the big moment, right? This is where David, being the man after God's own heart, will rip his shirt, put ashes on his head, and cry out to God and say, what have I done? What have I done? I have killed my friend. Who am I? Woe is me. That's what he does, right?
It's like in chapters 1 and 2, when he mourns over Saul and Abner and...
Yes! Yeah!
He commands his men to mourn.
Yeah, he mourns over the death of Saul. He mourns over the death of Jonathan. He mourns over the death of Abner. He mourns over the death of Ishbosheth. And he commands his men to mourn over them, even though they were all his enemies. And now here, one of David's closest friends has died by his own command. And David isn't commanding anybody to mourn.
Don't worry.
And he's not even mad. We don't see any fury on David's part. Instead, notice what he says. David said to the messenger, thus shall you say to Joab, do not let this matter displease you. For the sword devours now one and now another. Strengthen your attack against the city and overthrow it, and encourage him. You win some, you lose some. Oh well. Guess we just gotta rebuild and keep on trucking forward.
Just been collateral damage.
Just collateral damage. Just a few men.
Sounds like to me that it's a very different David than we've been seeing him.
Yeah. His friend of 25 to 30 years has been murdered by his own command. And he simply says, the sword's gonna do what the sword's gonna do. You know, the sword devours one after another. David, it's not the sword that devoured Uriah. You're the one who devoured Uriah. The sword was simply the vehicle by which you did it. right? Like this is so messed up. Like, even if David hadn't commanded this isn't how you respond whenever you lose people in war. I mean, like, this is just not a good king, right? I mean, like, even if David, like, imagine that the rest of the story was gone, right? Imagine that the chapter started in verse 22, and you simply read about this messenger talking to David and saying this, and you saw David's response. You would say, well, that's a weird response from David. Because even without knowing the rest of the story, this is not how David responds whenever his people die. He takes it very seriously. I mean, there's other places in the Bible where, like I think it's in Chronicles, or it might even be detailed later in Samuel, I forget. But where David's men will put their lives on the line to go into Bethlehem to get him some water. And he will pour the water out because he hates the fact that these men went and did that for him and put their lives on the line just to get him water. And like David, he cares for people. That's who he is. But this guy, he is just wiping the sweat off his brow because he's like, finally, I got away with it. There were no meddling kids to throw me off my groove. Right? This is, like, he gives a sigh of relief. Oh, thank God Uriah's dead. King, I just said that we lost the battle. Who wants that we lose some? Battle's gonna battle. You know, I mean, yep, swords. They go right through you. Like, this is, I don't know, this is just, like, so despicable. Like, this is just, like, genuinely, if David were in here right now, I've never, other than whenever I used to do martial arts, I've never punched somebody in the face, because that, you know, you actually had to do it. I genuinely, right now, I want to punch David in the face. It's like, David, I want to do more than that, honestly. But I'd like to consider myself of, you know, Uriah's level self-discipline right now. And I'd say a punch would do it. But the more fleshly part of me wants to do a lot worse to David. Because this is, like, David deserves a lot worse. Let's just track all the things that he's done so far. Let's walk through it. First off, he abandoned his duties, right? So that's one thing. He was just kind of slothful, right? Just chilling at home. Lustful. Adultery. Concealing sin. Hard-heartedness. Deceptiveness. Guiding other people into sin. What else?
Murder.
Well, yeah, I'm still working my way there. We'll get there eventually. What else has he done? I guess the deception, hard-heartedness kind of just are most of the story. What's that? Schemed, right? Yeah, he's scheming. Actively trying to guide somebody to sin. I think I already talked about that. Yeah, and then eventually...
He does.
What?
He does guide them into sin.
He does guide them into sin. He actually succeeds in his job, so he's actively fulfilling the role of the devil. And then, yeah, he murders. He has somebody murdered. Not directly, though, right? Honestly, I would probably respect David more if he just done it himself, right? If he had just taken Uriah into a room and just done it himself, I'd probably respect, like it'd still be horrible and the same effect would have happened. But instead, David didn't even have the audacity to do it himself because I can guarantee you he wanted to feel at least still a sliver of self-righteousness to where he could still, in the end, he could say, well, I didn't kill Uriah. It was in the battle. It happens. I just put Uriah in the toughest spot because I thought he was a great warrior. It's not my fault he died. Right? Like, it's just, he wants a modicum of self-righteousness still. And so he didn't have the audacity to do it himself. He just had Uriah deliver his own death note.
He also never sought, like, God's counsel. Like, if he didn't want to, like, say it out in public, he didn't even ask God in private.
Yeah.
You know, like, he didn't have a conversation with him or pray to him. Right?
Yeah. The only counsel he sought was the messenger asking, like, hey, who's that chick? Right? That's the only thing. David said to the messenger, thus you shall say to Joab, don't let this matter displease you. It should displease you. David, it should displease you. Like, yeah, Joab should be displeased, but you should too. Like, and you should want Joab to be displeased. He's your commander. If your commander isn't displeased by losing a battle, that's not good. And if the king is not displeased about losing a battle, that's not good. We've got so many issues here. For the sword devours now one and now another. Oh, well, I guess if the sword just keeps killing people, then that's fine, right? No. Maybe let's, like, find a way to get the sword to stop killing people rather than just treating it like, oh, What can I say? People die. No. It's a horrific thing. All because people die doesn't mean that death is just like a casual thing. It's like, oh, it's just whatever. No. It's still a big deal. And you should mourn this. And it's not just Uriah who died. Right? There are other innocent men. Like, even if David wanted just Uriah dead, others have died as well. But David simply doesn't care. He doesn't care. Like, this is just baffling. He doesn't care about anybody except himself. There are innocent men who serve him and are doing his job currently out in battle. And they died thinking they were fighting on his behalf, when really their king had abandoned them and had let them die for the sake of concealing his own sin. These men died outside the city of Rabbah thinking their king was a good man. They had no idea that their blood was being spilt because the king they tried to defend was actually using them as pawns to make others think that he was righteous. It's horrific. Strengthen your attack against the city and overthrow it, and encourage him. Come on, Joab, try harder next time. I know you got it in you. You fought battles before. Just go get him, Tiger. You got it next time. Don't sweat it. There's just a few dead people. We got more where that came from. When the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she lamented over her husband, as you should. And when the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. So now, not only has he gotten away with concealing his sin, but everybody else gets to look at David and thinks, wow, what a righteous man he is. He took in the widowed wife of one of his closest men so that she wouldn't be destitute the rest of her life. And not only has he gotten away with a sin and gotten to make himself look good, but in addition, that girl that he got to sleep with that one time is now his official wife. So he gets to sleep with her as much as he wants. So now he can continue to indulge his lust, and in his opinion, he's gotten away with it. And he would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for that meddling God. But the thing that David had done displeased Yahweh. This is where the Scooby-Doo theme song starts playing. Mm-hmm. That final phrase is probably the scariest phrase in the entire chapter. David is already such a scary figure in this chapter, but you read that last phrase and you're like, oh, David's in trouble. This is not going to go good. With great power comes great responsibility. When we saw David at the end of chapter 10, he had received the greatest power of any Israelite king to date. And under David and Solomon, Israel is going to be to the greatest it's ever been, historically, even to this day. Solomon's going to see it to the greatest boundaries and physical prestige. David saw it to the highest spiritual prestige, right? He was like the leader at like the highest spiritual revival area. Now it's going to be downhill because with great power comes great responsibility. He was God's holy king. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this Bible study, based on 2 Samuel chapter 7, when God made that promise to David, he specifically identified David through the covenant he made to him. And he said, the Messiah is going to come through you, basically. He identified David as the single most important human being living on the face of the planet at this point. Right? Because the Messiah is going to come through him, and he has an eternal dynasty. And that dynasty is not just David's dynasty, it is inevitably linked to God's reputation. Because this is the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Yahweh. Right? And David is the king sitting on the throne. And therefore, what David does ties to how people view Yahweh. And now David has done this unspeakable thing, and with great power comes great responsibility. Therefore, he's going to be held very accountable. When you get to James chapter 3, James tells the people, you should not all be teachers, for teachers will be judged more strictly. That doesn't just apply to teachers. It applies to everybody in authority. It applies to everybody who finds himself in a position of prestige. right? Whenever, like, even right here, whenever I'm leading this Bible study, I am more accountable before God. Because if I lead y'all astray, I'm going to have to answer to God about that, right? And this is not, I don't have any authority here. I'm just the one who talks the most, right? But I have, like, I'm going to be accountable to God for that. When I am in my Bible class, I'm accountable to God for that. Whenever you are a king of God's holy people and the promised Messiah is going to come through you and you are the figurehead of the eternal dynasty, yeah, you're accountable before God. And so this one, like all these sins that happen in chapter 11 are going to be, like, they're going to affect David's family the rest of, really up until Jesus, right? Fleeting moments of passion followed by a few days of trying to conceal sin, and it's going to inevitably lead to this whole catastrophe. We'll leave it there. Before we wrap up, application. What do we take from it? I know we've gone longer today, but hopefully that's fine with y'all. This chapter is wild. Application. What do we do with it?
Repent, when you sin, repent, and don't let it just eat you away.
Yeah. And honestly, maybe let's take like a active measure against sin.
Yep.
So, because the thing is, I don't even know if David's sin is eating him up at this point. I think he's so hard-hearted and callous that he's just fine with it. So maybe what we should do is, before we get to David's point here, let's actively be searching our hearts and see if there's any sin inside of us. Right? This is, and David prays this, right? Like that's the crazy thing. We haven't even talked about this. David is the psalmist of Israel. This is the same guy who wrote, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures." This is the same guy who said, "Oh Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth." This is the same exact dude. This is the same guy who, when he was on the run from Saul, said, "Oh God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My flesh yearns for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water." Same guy. Now his flesh is yearning for something totally different. It's also the same guy who said, "Search me, O God, and know my heart, and see if there be any grievous way in me." That's what we need to do. Right? We need to, before we get here, we need to look at ourselves and say, like, "God, search me. Help me figure out if there's something inside of me that is going to lead me down this path. I don't want to figure this out whenever I've already gotten another man's wife pregnant and he lies dead in a battlefield. I'd rather figure it out before I even step out on the balcony in the first place. So that as soon as I see that woman, I'm like, you know what? Maybe I shouldn't linger my eyes. We need to figure that stuff out ahead of time so that it never gets to this point. David did not do that, right? He prayed the prayers. He wrote the Psalms. They're etched in history for us to read and learn from, but he didn't do it himself. And he allowed himself to get to this point. So yeah, we need to check ourselves. Also, don't be a peeping Tom. That's probably a very straightforward application point. If you see a naked woman somewhere, maybe don't just keep looking. Just look away and be like, "Oh, sorry." Just call across, "Hey, can you close those blinds for me? Thank you." So that's also probably a much more straightforward application point. What else?
Don't even go into the situation to begin with. Like, make sure you're not in that situation to, like, begin with.
Yeah. Temptation is inevitable. Sinning is optional.
Yeah.
Right? Especially if we have Christ. I mean, if you don't have Christ, then you're kind of living in sin. So it's inevitable then. But we have the Holy Spirit dwelling inside of us. We have something that even David didn't have. Right? We have the Spirit dwelling inside of us, guiding us into repentance and guiding us into sanctification and shaping us. So yeah, there's temptation all around. That's inevitable. But don't give the devil a foothold, right? The devil's crouching at the door. We must rule over it. What else?
I don't quite know how to, like, articulate it, but I guess kind of, like, figure out, like, who you're content in. Because, like, in chapter 10, I feel like David is content in who God is, and then in chapter 11, he's content in who he is. So it's like in chapter 10, he's more worried about, like, what pleases God, to where he's just, like, freely and openly giving to these people and showing hesed to them aboundingly. And then you get to chapter 11, and he's so content in who he is, he's not able to recognize his own sin and look at God. So I guess, I don't know, something like that. Trying to figure out.
To quote David's great grandson, no one can serve two masters, right? You either serve God or money, right? The implications is that everybody's a slave to something, right? And we need to examine ourselves to figure out who are we serving, right? That's actually a discussion I had with one of my professors in college in the middle of class because he was trying to, I don't even, sound like philosophical discussion, I don't even remember what we were talking about, but somehow he was implying that like humans are trying to like be free of slavery. And I was like, well, no, we're always going to be slaves to something. It's a matter of choosing who we want to be a slave to, right? Because we're either going to be a slave to God or a slave to our passions. In the other chapters, David's a slave to God. And he, like, whenever God puts him in this prosperity situation where he's got everything, he doesn't view himself as entitled. He's like, who am I? Oh my gosh, thank you, God. You've given me so much, I want to share it with others. Because he's serving God. Here, though, he's serving himself. And all the things God has given him are not a means by which to help others, it's a means by which to advance his own lusts. And when I say lust there, I'm not just talking about sexual, I'm talking about desires in general, right? Just his desires of the flesh, desires of the eyes, pride of life. That's it's described in 1 John. Right? Who are you serving? Chapters 1 through 10, David is serving God. Chapter 11, David's serving himself. Unfortunately, I think that we spend 99% of our lives serving ourselves, and that's why we're typically impressed with David. Because David was actually pretty good at not serving himself. Psalm 27, right? A psalm of David. One thing have I asked of the Lord, and that shall I seek after, to dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord, and to meditate in his temple. David says, the only thing I want is to be as close to God as possible. You see that reflected in most of David's life. Right? He's doing all these different things. He's like, how can I get closer to God? Well, let's move the Ark of the Covenant to my neighborhood. Well, let me show God's hesed to somebody else. Let me show God's kindness to everyone around me so that people see God through me. Right? He's saying, that's how I dwell close to God. He's not asking that here. Right now, he is not considering, what brings me closer to God? That's the question we need to ask. Right? The decision I'm about to make, will it bring me closer to God or further from God? That's probably a better question than even asking, is this right or wrong? Because if we're just asking, is it right or wrong, we'll just go in like circles all over the time. Just be like, I don't know. Will it bring you closer to God or further? Yeah. Also, if you see somebody trying to honor their conscience and live in integrity, don't criticize them for it, and don't try to guide them into sin. And I know that we don't see a lot of instances like as extreme as this, but I have seen this, and maybe it's because I'm at a private school, but I see people doing this all the time, where like you've got some people who take God more seriously, and maybe they're just uncomfortable with doing certain things that you might not even consider sinful, right? And maybe they're not sinful, but for that person, it's a problem, right? It's a stumbling block, as Paul would put it. And I see, once again, I'm in a private school and kids are just brutal. But, like some of the students, they'll, mock and make fun of this person for actually having principles and trying to, live with integrity and not being comfortable with all the things that they're comfortable with.
Watching TV shows?
Well, yeah. Because there's some people, like for me, I'm more comfortable with watching certain TV shows than some other people might be. But it'd be really messed up with me to make fun of somebody else and be like, you wouldn't watch that TV show? What? You're lame. Well, no. Maybe they're just trying to honor God, and they are just not okay with the same thing you are, right? And that's fine. You can have differences there, but don't, because when you do that, you're doing to a lesser degree what David's doing with Uriah, right? We don't want to ever guide somebody into sin, because in doing that, not only are we guiding them into sin, but we're sinning against them and against God. So I just wanted to say that as well. That's probably another takeaway from this, because to me, that's one of the most disgusting things David does. Right? Even beyond the adultery and murder and all that stuff, one of the worst things he does in this is how he is trying to make a righteous person break. Right? That to me is just absolutely disgusting. And I absolutely that. That's the grimiest part, because it's the other stuff is more out in the open. Right? I mean, those are just external actions. But when David is acting like the voice of the serpent, trying to guide a righteous person into sin, that is messed up. And so let's not do that. Anything else? There's probably a million things we could talk about, but I know that y'all are probably tired. I could go on with this chapter for like years. Okay, cool. Can I get one of y'all to close us out in prayer, and then we will call tonight? Also, just an FYI, next week we'll go through chapter 12, and then for those who want to stay afterwards, or actually maybe we'll do something a little bit different. I'm just making an executive decision right now. We'll do chapter 12 next week, and instead of having a second Bible study afterwards, we'll actually, the week after that, we're actually going to go through a psalm that David wrote in response to this situation. I was going to say we'll just do the psalm afterwards, but I would actually rather go more in depth into the psalm. And so we'll just take a week in between chapter 12 and chapter 13, and we'll do that psalm there. That sounds better to me, so that we can actually go more in depth, because I think it's pretty good. So, yeah. One of y'all want to close us out in prayer?
Yes, I'll do it.
Go for it.
Dear Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for letting us have the opportunity to come here today and talk about your word and learn something from it today. Pray that everyone here that's leaving gets to whatever destination safely, and pray that this week until next Bible study we honor you and do the things you want us to do, and don't tempt others into sin. And in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.